Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. Today we have a special Juneteenth episode. For those of you who don't know, Juneteenth is celebrated as the day in which the last slaves in the United States learned of their emancipation in Texas in 1865. I decided that I wanted to do a special episode on nonviolence in relation to American slavery. Now, while I thought it would be best to highlight Black involvement in the nonviolent movement, I am not well-versed enough in that aspect yet to be able to speak knowledgeably. I've been doing a ton of reading from the Black community, like from Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Thurman, King. And then moderns like Jamar Tisby. So I've been reading a ton of books about Black history and from Black authors, but I haven't because I've been reading so much just to kind of catch up with things that I never read or knew about growing up because of my environment and the priorities that my community have. I have not dug into the nonviolent niche within the Black community, other than, of course, like in the civil rights era. And so I would want to do a lot more justice to that before I am able to speak about Black nonviolence throughout American history. So if you can excuse the fact that this episode is not going to feature Black nonviolent activists, hopefully you can understand my reasoning for that and wait for a future episode that is able to do that in the next few years, hopefully. As my reading list is already really long, so and if you have any good resources to shoot my way that would help me with this, I could definitely bump it to the top of my list because I would love to learn more about that. But instead, at the moment, I am going to actually take a look at the origins of abolition, particularly amongst the famous, maybe most famous, American nonviolent activists, which would be the Quakers. I'm aware that there were some abolitionist voices here and there throughout the centuries, even before the time that I'm going to talk about today. There are also very early humanitarian voices like De las Casas, who highlighted the egregious evils done against Native Americans. So I recognize that my starting point on abolition isn't perfect, or on humanitarian ideas. It's not perfect. But I think that today's episode is going to be a pretty good place to start. And I want to start by taking a look at the Quakers, and specifically at the life of a man named Benjamin Lay. For this episode, I'm going to be drawing heavily from a book entitled The Fearless Benjamin Lay, with the subtitle, The Quaker Dwarf Who Became the First Revolutionary Abolitionist. And I hope that the title has you intrigued already, because it caught me when I first saw it, I was like, I have to read that. So you should definitely pause this episode and go read that book. It's a relatively short book, and it's worth it. When you start delving into Christian pacifism, you'll be coming across the story after story of Quakers. You get Quaker stories in England, in the American colonies, and you even get Quakers coming into play when you don't really expect Quakers to be on the scene anymore. Like I remember when I was listening to Waging Nonviolence, or what's it called? Like City on a Hill. I forget, City of Refuge. Their podcast about André Torquemay and La Chambon. And it was surprising to me that I was coming across Quakers from the United States who were trying to do things to save Jews in France. I'm like, man, Quakers are just like really connected. They're always caught up in like these great justice issues, like the Holocaust or slavery. For as small as the Quaker sect is, it seems that they've more often than not been at the forefront of courageously attacking the worst evils that the world has to enact at the moment. And while most Protestants would take serious issues with some of their theology or ecclesiology, and admittedly, to me, some of this stuff sounds really strange, one has to admit that the fact that they continuously seem to find themselves on the side of justice and looking a whole lot like Jesus in that regard, and facing extreme consequences and social pressure for those things, and bucking against that, that says something pretty significant to me about them. Conversely, it says something pretty damning about my group, that my group historically tends to find itself on the wrong end of a lot of these issues. Ideally, you'd mix word and deed, ideology with praxis, but it seems like a difficult thing to find a lot of times when you look through history and you look into modernity as well. So as I was researching Quakers, my impression of the Quakers was very different than what I discovered them to be. I thought they were a pretty stoic, quiet sort of people, and maybe they are in general. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I remember sometimes when I'd sleep over at my grandparents, my grandma would have this saying, and I don't remember exactly how it goes, but it was something like, when it was time for me to shut up and go to sleep as a young kid, she'd say, "Quaker meeting has begun. No laughing, no talking, no chewing of gum." And then it would continue on, something about like go to sleep. So my idea of Quakers was that they were a stoic bunch. But as I read more and more about them, I realized that they could also be quite a fiery bunch. And I suppose that makes sense if they were born in the civil unrest of 17th century England. They only really came around about the year 1650, and largely they grew out of the lower and lower middle class. While there were a number of anti-slavery individuals and known anti-slavery pushes within the Quaker community as early as 1688, and among some of the founders like Fox, it wasn't something that they were particularly known by at first. In fact, by the early 1700s, as you get into third-generation Quakers, you actually have a number of Quakers who have gotten pretty wealthy, especially in the colonies, and you have a decent number of Quaker slave owners. And even if one Quaker isn't a slave owner, chances are that someone who either has influence over them or someone with whom they associate is a slave owner. And of course, the slave owners tended to be the more wealthy, kind of for both reasons, right? If you're wealthy, you can afford slaves, but also the people who got slaves tended to become more wealthy because they're getting virtually free labor other than their initial investment. So the influential people within the Quaker community were wealthy and they had slaves. So to be somebody who speaks out against slavery would have social consequences, potentially. Nevertheless, one thing I appreciate about the Quaker community is that they tend to have a solid prophetic stream, meaning that even if the status quo kept silent about slavery, there's enough of a prophetic tradition to raise up someone who would be vocal against it. That's one thing I appreciate about the Quakers, which I think is lacking a lot of times in Protestantism, in part because we're so fragmented that we can just create new denominations when we have a problem. The Quakers seem to kind of hash things out and confront each other with things, which is something that ironically you find in nonviolent communities. You look at somebody like Hauerwas, and he talks constantly about the importance of confrontation and conflict because that helps to resolve issues and work issues out and not allow sin to grow like yeast, spread like yeast. And so conflict and confrontation are very important aspects of a lot of nonviolent communities. And that's also a loving thing, to not let brothers and sisters not only diminish the light of Christ that you're sharing to the world, but also to not allow sin to reign within them because you care for their souls. So, at this time, when Quakers many have become wealthy and slave owners, enter prophetic Benjamin Lay. Now, Benjamin Lay was under 4 feet. He was a hunchback and a dwarf and a Quaker abolitionist. His early life as a sailor was particularly influential in convincing Lay about the horrors of slavery. He spoke with slaves from all over the globe, and he was horrified by how terribly they were treated. He was especially appalled at how the women were treated, hearing stories of how the trip across the Atlantic involved the captain and sailors keeping women in their quarters and raping them several times a day. And that's with slavery, just like with the Holocaust, it's like the more I read, I feel like I know at the utter depravity that humans have. But then you hear stories and you're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense that the captain and sailors would rape women coming across the ocean. But man, I never really thought about that as being just another aspect of the horror of slavery. Something similar happened the other week when I was reading Night by Elie Wiesel, and he talked about how some of the boys in his camp ended up being better fed, the young boys being better fed than anyone else. And, you come to find out, well, that's because one of the commandants has an affinity for young boys, and so he uses them for sex in the Holocaust camps. And you're like, man, for as bad as the Holocaust is, the starvation, the sickness, the colds, the death, the separation, you just throw in being sexualized as a boy, being raped by a man over and over and over again throughout your stay. It's just one more horrible thing that you throw into the mix, that like your mind thinks that it's already maxed out the horror of such an event. But there's always more. There's always something that adds more complexity and evil to how terrible it was. And that's what, reading this and discovering what the captain and sailors did to slave women on the journey, that's what that did to me. My wife brought up a good point, because I think a lot of times the reason I would have never thought of them sexualizing slaves is because you hear people even today just saying, they were men of their times, and they just didn't really realize, they thought that they were animals, they thought that they were subhuman, and they were wrong, but that's what they really thought. But my wife brought up a really good point when I told her about this new discovery of the horrors of slavery. And she said, well, that seems to really undermine the idea that whites thought slaves were subhuman. Because they back themselves into a corner here when they sexualize their slaves, because either the whites had to think that they were raping a human, which is horrendous and evil, and they know it, or they had to think that they were engaging in bestiality, which is despicable and evil and horrendous. So, like, what is it? Were you having sex with an animal? Is that what you thought? Or did you think that you were raping a human being? Like, what were you doing? And it just shows you that people were so screwed up, and there was no justification for these things. And that's something that Benjamin Lay saw. He's like, there is no justification. People in my time, we know better. And Lay discovered some other things. He discovered that the slaves so he worked with some slaves at times while he was on his ships, and he discovered that slaves in Muslim countries were often treated way better than slaves of Christians. And that just didn't comport for Lay. How is it possible that Christians aren't treating their slaves better? When Lay spent several years of his life living in Barbados, a place with approximately a 9-to-1 slave-to-white ratio, he made friends with a lot of slaves. And he and his wife who was also a hunchback dwarf named Sarah Lay, they would throw parties, and they'd invite slaves to their parties, almost like a Saturnalia of sorts, but more frequently, it seems. And the masters of their slaves often didn't want them to come, because you don't affect the hierarchy. Like, you don't want the slaves to feel this freedom, because especially with a 9-to-1 ratio, you need to keep the slaves under subjection and knowing their place. But through these parties, and just because he treated slaves as human, Lay befriended this one slave who told him that he just couldn't take his master's weekly beatings, a Christian master at that. And eventually, not too long afterwards, the slave ended up committing suicide, and there was nothing that Lay could do about it. Now, Lay's firsthand experience, coupled with the stories he heard from slaves on his ships that he was working on, that convinced him that slavery had no place amongst Christians. Lay would spend the rest of his life fighting slavery, not at the legislative level, but at the level of the church. Now, Benjamin Lay was a really interesting guy, not just because of his unique physical appearance, but Lay also engaged in what the author of the book calls guerrilla theater. The craziest guerrilla theater that Lay did was when he hollowed out a book and he put a bladder filled with red liquid inside of it. He then, in the middle of a meeting, stood up and pronounced judgment on slaveholders, and he pierced the book with a knife, which the Quakers weren't supposed to have, or a sword, I guess. And he declared that judgment was coming on them if there was not repentance. Lay also did some other things that weren't guerrilla theater, but more of just, taking stands. Like he would refuse to eat with slaveholders or be served by slaves. If he was served by slaves, he'd pay the slaves, which subverted the hierarchy and the owners didn't like, made a statement against them. One of the boldest things that he did was he confronted a couple about their slaves, and he told them that it's horrendous what they were doing, that they were willing to separate families. And they ignored him, of course, and they dismissed him. But later, one day he found their child, a young child, I don't know how young, but, young, and he had the child come to his cave, of course, because the hunchback dwarf abolitionist Quaker guy lived in a cave, right? Where else would someone like that live? So she's just this super interesting guy. But he invites this boy to this cave where which was his house, and the boy spends all day there. Well, the parents, by the end of the day, they're looking frantically for him, and finally Benjamin's like, "Oh yeah, he's been in my cave all day. He's safe, he's fine." But he told the parents, "Now just a momentary feeling of the pain and anguish that you are causing to other human beings who are your slaves. Don't you forget that." So yeah, he did some pretty strange things and some pretty courageous, stupid, I don't know, depending on how you want to look at it. Did some pretty crazy things. But he was nothing if he wasn't consistent. He saw the justification of slaveholding as an outworking of greed for wealth. Because when you look at it, the original Quakers were lower or lower middle class, and Quakers were now becoming very wealthy. Benjamin didn't have much nice to say about wealth and greed, and as Benjamin would argue, and it seems to me the more I read it, the New Testament and the early church fathers don't have anything nice to say about that either. So the compromise of slavery was a natural result of what Lay identified as greed and the allure of wealth. It's a chicken and an egg thing. Slavery came because people are greedy and because wealth had a hold on their lives, not the other way around. Desire gives birth to sin. And of course, the Quaker assemblies that Lay assaulted were run by none other than the most wealthy, who in turn were slaveholders. And these slaveholders gained their position because of their wealth, in part because, right, that gives you a lot of influence and you can give people things and it's comfortable for people to treat the wealthy nice and to give them influence. And nobody wanted to offend them because they would eat at their houses and they would benefit from them. So these individuals, these slaveholders, kept their positions because of the cowardice of people and the greed of people below them. It was easier to justify greed and slavery than it was to confront it and lose one's comfort and the influence of the most powerful in society. But Lay didn't let that get to him because he lived a consistent life that shunned wealth and greed, and so he wasn't influenced by those things. He wasn't compromised by them, and he could speak truth to power because he didn't grasp at that power. So in this throwing off of the grasping of power, Lay ended up spending the last third of his life living in a cave. He consumed pretty much only what he grew himself. He made his own clothes, and he lived an extremely, extremely simple life. And when he did die, he ended up bequeathing the money that he had earned early on in life and just not spent because he had no needs. He bequeathed that to the poor in the congregation and the community. And also, he gave it to people who spent much of their lives attacking him as an eccentric. Some of the people who threw him out of meetings, not the people he identified as greedy, but just some of the regular people who he just had run-ins with or who enforced the congregation's decision to throw him out. he ended up bequeathing them money as well. So that kind of gives you an idea of the character of Lay. So Lay did some pretty crazy things, and he did some things that make me cringe. If someone did stuff like that today, I'd probably write them off as, oh, that's so embarrassing. But at the same time, when I look at things in retrospect, knowing that Lay was absolutely right about this issue of slavery, it makes me wonder if his methodology wasn't legitimate most of the time. Because of Benjamin Lay, the groundwork of abolition was laid. Lay influenced later Quakers like Woolman, who was considered responsible for bringing abolition to Quakers and for that being finally accepted and becoming standard. Because it was Woolman who got the Philadelphia Convention to ban slavery in 1776, and they began to censure Quakers that didn't get rid of their slaves. Woolman and the Quakers also advocated that slave owners reimburse their slaves for all of their back pay, which is crazy. Like that's a crazy expectation. Woolman, like Lay, also did some cool things. Like when he would visited slave owners and he was served by slaves, he would pay the slaves for their services that he received. And that way he sent a message to the slave owners as well as to treating slaves with dignity. And that was really subversive to overthrow this hierarchy. But Benjamin Lay didn't just influence Quakers like Woolman. He also rubbed shoulders with people like Benjamin Franklin, the man who published Lay's infamous book, All Slave Keepers Apostates, which is probably the most influential anti-slavery book ever for the abolition movement. It influenced the future abolition books and thinkers. He influenced the likes of famous patriot Benjamin Rush and thinkers like Voltaire. Lay was hugely influential in birthing and growing the abolition movement of the next generation. So I don't know. It makes me wonder if we are just cowards and this Old Testament prophetic sort of witness stuff is good. And I just don't have a strong enough conviction to proclaim the truth as Lay did. I'm too comfortable, and I rub shoulders with the people who I need to call out, or maybe I'm one of the people that needs to be called out. Or was Lay right in ideology but wrong in his methodology? Is what he did too uncouth? Is that not winsome? Regardless of how you look at it, I do think Lay did one thing right. His attack wasn't on legislation. He was calling out the community, which claimed to be the light of Christ. That's who he was pointing fingers at. He was calling for Christian consistency. And it's interesting that as the Quakers came around to abolition, officially ending it in 1776, 30 years before Britain's first move to end it, and 60 years before Britain completely abolished it in the empire, it's interesting that their indirect influence on others seemed to be a contributing factor in abolition's rise. So by Benjamin purifying the church, I don't know if you can directly link it, but it seems like the purification of the Quakers actually ended up rubbing off on the broader community. As the Quakers began to live out abolition consistently, it helped to change the culture around them as they rubbed shoulders with others and influenced others. Now, as far as this episode goes, I'm not going to go into a ton more detail on Benjamin Lay. I highly recommend the book The Fearless Benjamin Lay to fill in more details if you'd like. You can find it on Scribd as an audio or digital book. I haven't gotten to Lay's book, All Slave Keepers Apostates, but I hope to do that one day as well, and you can find it on Kindle for 99 cents. So I have it ready to go when I get around to it, but it'll probably be a while. Instead of going into Lay's life, which the book will be better for you anyway, what I do want to do in this episode is make some observations that tie in a lot of what we've discussed throughout the season on nonviolent action, as well as to set up our final 2 episodes in the season. So let's make some observations here. First, this story of Benjamin Lay helps me to see the importance of a willingness to self-sacrifice. Benjamin Lay was a voice in the wilderness. He took a lot of hits for preaching the right thing. Now, we could say that he took the biggest hits for being so forceful in the way that he proclaimed the message, but then we have to ask in what other way a message of such importance could have been proclaimed. I mean, you're talking about keeping people in bondage, raping them, selling their families and splitting them up, beating them. Like, in what other way was this message to be proclaimed to the deaf? How do you do it other than yell? This problem of slavery was ever before the colonies. Everything one touched, visiting church members who owned slaves, going to the docks, eating sugar. No matter what you touched, slavery was everywhere. If a culture is so numb to such an egregious evil, maybe what Benjamin did was the only sane and moral thing to do. But then, of course, that makes me evaluate my life and our current issues. Should I be more vocal, even seemingly crazy, about certain egregious injustices? I'm becoming more and more convinced that God calls me to less and less cowardice, but I still struggle figuring out where the line is between winsome courage and insane fanaticism. I don't know. Something to ponder. Number 2, the issue of prophetic witness leads to a second point. It's impossible for us to be prophetic witnesses, at least effective ones, if our lives aren't consistent. Lay realized that he couldn't possibly make the extreme calls he made on the lives of others if he benefited from slavery himself. If he dined with slavers and was served by slaves without paying them, or if he used the goods that were products of slavery, like sugar, which he saw produced en masse by slaves in Barbados, then how could he preach against the ills of slavery when he benefited from it? It's easy not to own slaves, but it's a whole lot harder to not be tainted by a system that makes our lives easier and more comfortable, whether that is direct comfort of products that we purchase or the indirect comfort of refusing to socially ostracize oneself from the wealthier and more influential who are engaged in slavery. Either way, it all boils down to greed. I want to be connected to power, or I want cheaper goods, or I don't want to stop enjoying sugar, right? And Benjamin saw that firsthand. Greed made you complicit with the system. In small ways or big ways, it doesn't matter. As Solzhenitsyn talked about the importance of small truths, stripping away the facade of evil, it doesn't matter whether you're complicit in small truths or small lies or big lies. It's all part of one big system of violence. And so Lay withdrew from that system of violence so he could preach consistently. I think part of the reason it's hard for me to be a prophetic witness about injustices today is because I'm too selfish to bring myself to disconnect from the indirect benefits I gain from that injustice or from going along with an unjust system. I'm too comfortable. And it's hard to be so prophetic because I know that I'm a hypocrite and I'm complicit in the system myself. And I think point number 2 rears its head in a different way that I'll make my third point. Where you fail to see prophetic witness, you tend to see complicity with injustice to some degree. And where you see someone engaged in open injustice, you tend to see a network of sin. The roots always go deeper than the surface shows. And you see this in the story of Benjamin Lay in that he identified greed and a lust for wealth as a growing problem in the Quaker community. Quakers had once been simple people, but now many were accruing great wealth and using that to gain influence. Lay realized that the acceptance of slavery wasn't just some moral compromise that came out of the blue. It ended up being justified and perpetuated because of a network of sin, with greed at its center. Riches are often an indicator in the Old and New Testament that something is morally amiss. It may not be inherently wrong to have wealth, but the Bible and the early church show us that Christians should consider it a very hot potato and try to get rid of that pretty fast. If we hold on to it for too long, we'll inevitably get burned. I was listening to a podcast a few months ago, and the individual on the podcast made a statement that resonated significantly with me, and I've mentioned it in previous episodes. But he said that he did work in like slums overseas with his family, and he's like, working with those organizations and working with the poor, you tend to get people who don't go in as pacifists who end up coming out as pacifists because they see the great amount of violence that is done primarily to the poor. Violence is generally done against the poor because they don't have access to the system, but also because the people who are wealthy, by and large, have greed at the center, and because when you have a sin, you have a network of sins. When you see greed, you will get other sins, and violence tends to kind of come out of greed at some point, whether that's violence directly harming somebody or whether that's the violence of creating systems that oppress. And I found something very similar when it was me being in our church's diaconate and working with the poor that helped me to see we're not living the right way at all in regards to how we treat the oppressed. And when I went back to see Jesus' words in the Beatitudes, and I started to realize that I think Jesus is more radical than we've made him out to be because we've made him out to be like us, then I was able to reevaluate all of his words, including the nonviolence and enemy love. I'll link a great article about the embezzlement of the church, which talks about the early church and their view on poverty and stuff. I'll post that in the show notes, and I could go on and on about this topic, and I think I'm going to have a season on this, on poverty and such, at one point. But for now, go ahead and read that article, and I'll just drop this concept here and not go down that rabbit trail anymore. But anyway, it's interesting how at the end of Lay's life, when some of the main culprits that he pointed out for their greed and for slavery, when they ended up dying, he found out that their greed and power-mongering, in all of that, they'd actually engaged in other moral issues like embezzlement of government funds. So Lay's observation and critique that, look, when you see something like slavery and that's justified, you keep digging. There are roots all over the place, and you're not just going to find one problem. You're going to find a network of problems, and that's part of what Lay was trying to get rid of when he lived a simple life. He recognized how one thing leads to another. But that's not how most of us see it, right? We see wealth and therefore influence, and we give those people leadership positions, which you see in churches all the time. It's a certain type of person that gets leadership, which it isn't bad that people of a certain type, like businessmen type, get leadership, but you just don't see like early church types of things where you have fishermen and poor people in leadership at all. It just doesn't happen. And Lay recognized that as a problem. And I would even say in the 2020 election when Piper came out with an article against Trump, or at least saying, hey, look, pride's a big deal too. Our Christian community couldn't grasp that concept of this network of sins. And they just kind of looked for a 1-to-1 ratio and saying, well, abortion is absolutely terrible. And now you're talking about to me about this kind of esoteric pride thing that, everybody has pride. What's the big deal? But, the point is, I just read an article about President Trump, because this is almost Thanksgiving 2020, when I'm recording this. But President Trump just, was trying to consider bombing Iran because Iran now has more nuclear, it's amassed more nuclear, not weapons, but material. And he's like, hey, can we bomb them before I leave office? And it's like, he backed out of a nuclear deal. So Iran starts to, they're not held accountable for that anymore. So they start doing what they were going to do. And now he's considering bombing them. And it's like, your pride knows no bounds. Like in order to look tough on something, or in order to accomplish everything that you said you wanted to accomplish, or whatnot, the things that you're willing to say and do in order to look good, like not denounce Saudi Arabia for chopping up a journalist because they make you a lot of money and it'll make you look better to have all that money, and because they're whatever. Like pride, just you're gonna find a network of sins, and pride is one of the biggest issues that you're gonna see in something like the Book of Proverbs about rulers and stuff. So this network of sins idea is very huge. It's like an iceberg. You're only gonna see something. And Benjamin recognized this. Like when I see the issue of slavery, I bet as you uncover more and more of somebody's life, you're going to find a lot of really big problems. And that at least worked out with the individuals that Benjamin was critiquing. All right, number 4. I love getting a glimpse of Lay's work in the church. My impression was that Lay wasn't really trying to go outside of the church at all, though I don't know that 100%. It didn't really talk about pursuing legislation. I don't know if Lay would have been opposed to that. But Lay seemed to realize that the primary issue was getting his community, the church, to live lives of purity and consistency, which they eventually did by and large. Now, it's amazing to see how rather than leave the Quaker community when they tried to push him out, he fought to stay in it. He loved the majority of the people who were against them and repented where he needed to, but he kept pushing where he needed to as well. You see a community that continued to wrestle with each other, to censure each other where they felt they needed to, and to repent. It's a beautiful picture of what the church ought to be rather than the denominational consumerist framework that we have today in many Protestant denominations. It was by purifying the Quaker movement that they were able to be a voice and a framework for the abolition movement that came after them. In the same year and in the same city that the Declaration of Independence was signed by a group that ended up writing slavery into the new nation they would form, the Quakers, in the same city, same year, wrote slavery out of their presence. To my knowledge, they were the first major European group in this era to end slavery, to even talk about it to the extent that they did. And that set some precedents and influenced future abolitionists. Yet we, July 4th, we commemorate what our founding fathers did in their breaking off of Great Britain, which then allowed for westward expansion and genocide of the Native Americans, and which eventually wrote slavery into our Constitution. But we don't celebrate the fact that the Quakers wrote slavery out of their presence in that same year in Philadelphia. So purification of the church was the focus. And I think we've argued a lot that should be our focus as Christians. Number 5. One thing you see in many nonviolent movements is that class is vital to change sentiment. Lay and many abolitionist Quakers were lower or lower middle class, and they were often fighting against the upper middle class or the wealthy. However, what we see in many modern nonviolent movements is that revolutions occur when the middle class and intellectuals get on board. Iran is a prime example of this in their revolution of 79. The same thing happened in the story of Benjamin Lay. While Lay and other Quakers had to push against the wealthier Quakers and many of the wealthy in society, their ideas eventually did catch on. But it was only when men like Wilberforce and Voltaire, more well-to-do men or intellectuals, when they came on board, that things really started to change for abolition. Nations tend to respond to influence and economic interests, and a movement that isn't diverse enough to include those with money and influence often ends up falling short. 6th observation here. This brings up another point that we've talked about before, which is that legislation is often only implemented once it doesn't hurt the nation that implements it. So how was Britain able to make its first act of abolition in the early 1800s? Well, they no longer had a huge group of colonies which heavily used slave labor. It didn't hurt them as much anymore to abolish slavery. However, Britain didn't fully abolish slavery until 1833, and when it did, it paid the slave owners for their slaves. It didn't compensate the slaves, as far as I'm aware. The only group who did that, who compensated their slaves to a large extent, were the Quakers, and that was self-imposed. That was voluntary. That wasn't government-enforced. In fact, if you look at it, and I'll post this in the show notes, but Britain was paying on their slave debt, their debt to slave holders, from 1833 all the way through 2015. So the legislation that abolished slavery cost Britain 180 years worth of taxes. Of course, the slave owners didn't mind giving up their property at that point, right? If you're going to get paid a bunch of money to do it, sure, go ahead, write that legislation, pay me, that's fine. That legislation was hugely lucrative to them. Plus, the slaves weren't just disbanded, they were phased out. And even then, slavery wasn't made completely, absolutely illegal. Every now and then, illegal slaves would be seized, and they'd be taken to, I think it was Sierra Leone, where they were forcefully enslaved for up to 14 years. So it wasn't technically, life slavery. Well, one of the leaders of Sierra Leone, he was, appalled by this, and he was given governorship of that district. I don't know, part of the empire for Britain, and he balked at the fact that they kept getting shipments of slaves in, and he was promptly dismissed by none other than William Wilberforce, the great abolitionist. Now, Wilberforce was against slavery, but he had helped to make a deal that he thought he needed to make in order to mostly abolish slavery. And so when this guy came into Sierra Leone and tried to upset that system, that deal that Wilberforce had made, Wilberforce was like, nah, we got to keep slavery around in this small way, so that I can keep my word about slavery, about not completely ending it, but allowing the people of Sierra Leone to continue to profit off of it. So Wilberforce took this lesser of two evils approach, and thus he prevented the full abolition of slavery by the new governor of Sierra Leone, and actually dismissed him for attempting to do so. So even the full abolition of slavery is way more complex, and there's a lot more to go into with people like Wilberforce and assessing their actions and such. Now, at the same time, the colonies went full force into slavery. It was too lucrative to give up. It may have even been a part of what drove them to rebellion. I don't know. We know westward expansion was one reason they wanted independence, and perhaps they knew that abolition was coming down the pipes as well. Who knows? But as it was with Britain, so it was with the States. Slavery was only abolished once it was already going out of style, and it was more lucrative to do so. And we addressed that in our CRT episode last season. Now, it doesn't mean I'm not happy that legislation was eventually put in place. It just means that I think the cultural shift is the most important, and that always precedes legislation, and hearts need to be changed. It doesn't follow legislation. Legislation to us seems like where the power is at, but it's not. Trying to lead with legislation is the dog chasing its own tail. It's putting the cart before the horse. And Benjamin Lay realized that, I think, and his focus was on the Quaker meetings and the Christian community. And that brings me to my last point. Benjamin Lay's guerrilla theater is brilliant. Sure, it was also abrasive, but I think Lay shows us what Solzhenitsyn was getting at when he talked about exposing lies. Lay put the immorality of slavery ever before the people. They couldn't ignore it or forget it. The parents of the child Lay took to his cave knew what it meant to keep slaves every time they worried about their son from that day forward. Those who dined with Lay thought about their comfort and consumption as complicity with slavery every time Benjamin paid slaves for their wages or refused to take sugar. While these seem like very small steps, Benjamin Lay was able to bring the evil of slavery to the forefront of everyone's mind through his demonstrations. He shined light on the darkness. And quite honestly, I wonder if that's not why God had Benjamin Lay be a dwarf hunchback. Benjamin couldn't walk anywhere without being noticed. And when he did his antics, you couldn't erase that out of your mind. And because his life was so centered on abolition, when you did think of Lay or when you did see him, slavery was going to be the first thing that would have come to anyone's mind. One couldn't get the image of Benjamin out of their minds, and in some ways, his twisted figure was a perfect reminder of the twisted evil of the slavery he preached against so vehemently. Benjamin himself was maybe the best object lesson, a walking object lesson of slavery and abolition. Lay helps to encourage me to understand the importance of speaking truth, even small truths, or big truths in small ways. Daily unmasking lies is the greatest nonviolent action we can all participate in. It was through the life of Benjamin Lay that so many others realized the truth, and within a generation were changing public sentiment and national policy against slavery. Go read The Fearless Benjamin Lay, and thank God that he uses people like him to do great things. And this Juneteenth, recognize that one of the main reasons Quakers were so prominent in rescuing runaway slaves and joining in the abolition movement and why the world's sentiment shifted against slavery is because of a dwarf hunchback Quaker abolitionist named Benjamin Lay. That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it.